Hi all, Kurt Felska here, and we're excited to bring you another great webinar this week. This week's topic is about what framework debates are going to look like on the criminal justice reform topic. You all are really lucky because tonight's guest is one of the leading thinkers in debate on framework. In fact, she gives about 5 hours worth of lectures camp-wide at the Michigan camp and stirs people's emotions on both sides pretty well. So Jasmine Stidham is a coach at Harvard, Westlake and Dartmouth College, and she's been a lab leader in the 7-week program for many years, I think probably 4 or 5 at this point. As the lecture goes on, if you come up with any questions for Jazzy, just put them in the Q&A and she will answer a few of them afterwards. All right, Jazzy, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Kurt. All right, hello, everybody. All right, so today's webinar will be focused on my thoughts, predictions, and ideas for approaching framework on the criminal justice reform topic. This lecture isn't going to cover like all the framework basics, like how do I go for procedural fairness against my identity F. Those things will be covered during the normal framework lecture, the normal framework marathon, if you will, in the summer at camp. So today, I'm just going to kind of give a broad overview of how I think AFs will likely approach the topic from a critical perspective, and how neg teams should start thinking about their framework strategies against critical affirmatives. So we're going to cover the following: AF predictions. Where will critical affirmatives like gravitate toward? What are some of the core critiques of criminal justice reform? Why I think this is a good year for critical affirmatives compared to previous years. How neg teams should start thinking about adjusting, their strategies, their blocks, etc. Some common themes in affirmative offense against framework, and then some suggested readings. And again, there will be a Q&A at the end, so please write down your questions and submit them for discussion because I would love to answer all of your questions. All right, so hot take. Depending on who you are, this may or may not seem like a hot take. Personally, I don't think it's that spicy of a take, but a lot of people see this topic and might think like, oh my God, neg state action, soft left AFs galore, there's no way a K team could be able to like beat the TBA. And I think that assessment is a bit naive for a few reasons. First, we should stop and think for a second and analyze what makes a topic good, like for K teams on the affirmative. The simple answer is literature. Criminal justice reform intersects with every single critical literature base. So not only will there be like an abundance of literature on CJR, but it's also going to be quality and new in most instances. Like you're not going to go have to, dig through back files and like really, really old, journals or something to find quality evidence. Critical scholars write about criminal justice reform a lot. So it's not going to be hard to find those cards. If anything, I think it'll be more difficult for K teams on the AF to choose which cards to put in their 1AC because there will just be so many. And these cards will be specific to the resolutional mechanism. If you've ever listened to the Framework Marathon during previous summers, you know that I usually rant a lot about the importance of focusing on the resolutional mechanism. Generally, one of the most important factors in determining whether or not a KAF is like high quality and difficult to answer or kind of, bleh, is whether or not the affirmative includes a critique of the resolutional mechanism. So this year, I think this means KAFs should have very good topic-specific indites of criminal justice reform and those legal mechanisms. I expect all of that to happen. And within this literature, there will also be plenty of examples that demonstrate why reform fails and sometimes causes more harm overall. It's not going to be hard for AF teams to write a laundry list of examples when the criminal justice reform failed, various marginalized groups, despite being reformed. So neg teams will have to make sure that you have a hefty list of examples proving that reform can be effective. Now this year's topic is different compared to like the recent arms sales topic. Being a K team on arms sales for the most part was kind of rough, right? Like for all the reasons why it's sick to be a K team on CJR are also reasons why it was a lot harder to be a K team on arms sales. Even doing research for Ks generally on arms sales was difficult depending, on the K. Now, obviously, reducing arms sales to Saudi is like a good idea. So how are K teams supposed to get around that? Most successful K teams had to get links to other parts of the AF that were about reps, impact framing and the like. And many teams were successful in doing so for sure, but that doesn't mean it still wasn't an uphill battle for most K teams. I say all of this because I want neg teams to understand that this year will not be a cakewalk in terms of going for framework. And I think our class debates will actually be a lot better, honestly, just due to there being like an excellent scholarly debate within the literature. But given this observation, I think neg teams should start to get creative and start researching these concepts now, as opposed to waiting right before the season opener. And we'll discuss ways to do that. All right, AF predictions. Which critiques will be popular? Short answer, probably like all of them to some degree, but the long answer is that we can rank them in terms of strength based on the quality of literature. All of the standard ologies and isms will find their way into a critical affirmative one way or another. No, I don't think like the security K is going to be a popular KF or anything, but most of the community's like prevalent critiques can be expected to be, critical affirmatives for this topic. Now, in terms of quality of the literature and the strength of the literature, the better your cards are, the better chance of winning, right? Like we generally associate those things with one another. So these rankings that I have here aren't like my personal opinions on which Ks I happen to like more. These are just some predictions based on which areas of scholarship are stronger on CJR. People might disagree, it's totally fine. I'm just but one person offering some predictions. The first is Afropessimism. I assume a lot of people, expect this. There are a lot of different versions of Afropessimism. There's not just one type of Afropessimism, but broadly speaking, it'll be an extremely popular area of scholarship that many teams will gravitate toward. The next is just like anti-blackness. And yes, this does deserve like a separate category. There will be different forms that these arguments take. There's like racial capitalism, logistics, race war, etc. Arguments that are about anti-blackness, but aren't necessarily Afropessimism. Next is Black feminism. There will certainly be plenty of scholarship centered on Black feminist approaches to criminal justice reform. And I have a second number 3 in there because I can't count apparently, but next is settler colonialism. There are excellent angles within settler colonial studies and indigenous studies that critique the process of reform that we can expect to see. And then next is queerness. I think this, along with other variations of queer theory, again, there's not just one, will make a huge comeback in ways that we maybe haven't seen in some of the previous topics that we've had, like with arms sales and like immigration, just based on like, again, the themes that are prevalent for criminal justice. So I think that's one like new thing to look out for. Next, maybe good old CAP could make a comeback. I don't know. I don't think it'll be as popular just compared to, other literature bases, but it's certainly, possible. And then, we have all the other random like POMO, garbly-goo and POMO adjacent stuff. I'm sure someone will find a way to talk about like Jared or something. Cybernetics, might be more of a thing too, just given, again, like prisons and stuff and reform. So that's the general areas. And now we're going to kind of break down some of those. So as mentioned previously, Afropessimism and other anti-blackness based arguments probably going to be the #1 theme for critical affirmatives. I'm certainly no expert in this area and I don't, pretend to be. So if I'm missing something, feel free to like let me know in the Q&A. It's important that we don't generalize Afropessimism and anti-blackness, both for like ethical, reasons and also strategic reasons. Not all anti-blackness arguments are Afropessimist in nature, but all Afropessimist arguments do make arguments about anti-blackness generally. It's the whole like square, like rectangle thing. We don't want to homogenize the works of these authors because respecting scholarly distinctions, I think, is pretty important and not hard to do. It's also bad to generalize for strategic reasons. So like if you lump all arguments about Black people under one header on verbatim, you probably won't have a great time. So it's necessary to treat these maybe similarly, but still distinct and deserving of their own like unique set like of responses. So here are several sort of like authors and areas that teams will likely utilize. So first, again, Afropessimism. I'm thinking here like standard Afropessimists, the scholars like who identify as Afropessimists, like Wilderson, who has a new book out, by the way, and there's like one chapter that I think will be really good for this new topic. So that's something to look out for. Sexton, Hartman, certain parts of Warren, that aren't just like based on Heidegger, etc. Next, we have racial capitalism and like logistics. Here, I'm just mostly thinking about like Moten and Harney's work and how that could potentially apply to the topic. I think they have excellent pieces on the role of racial capital and criminality. So those are certainly some things to look out for. Next is race war. This was popular this past season. I don't really see it going away. You know, maybe it will, I don't know, but either way, that is another subtopic to think about. Next is necropolitics. There are a lot of articles about prison necropolitics and anti-blackness that I found while I was researching. All right, next, Black feminist approaches. So there are several like areas that teams will likely utilize. While Black feminism can often overlap with many of the arguments I mentioned previously, I think we should like analyze it separately just so we understand some of those nuances. And again, not an expert, but when I did some reading and research, I tried to understand these broad themes, and here's kind of what I came across. So if you Google like the phrase Black feminist criminology, you will get a lot of results. So I recommend doing so because that'll kind of give you an understanding about how Black feminists approach the topic in a unique way that maybe other, you know, generic anti-Blackness arguments might not. Other common themes that I saw, like phrases like Black feminist thought and praxis, misogynoir, anti-carceral feminism, and more. Those ones were just, you know, the ones that stood out. I listed out some really important authors on this topic that, you know, you are free to like look into if you're, you know, trying to write one of these affirmatives, or if you're trying to research these authors and their arguments to understand how to respond to them. These are some of the ones that come up quite frequently when it comes to, again, Black feminist approaches. All right, next, Black trans feminism. So there's a lot of literature about Black trans feminisms and approaches to the topic. Again, a lot of this might overlap with previously mentioned stuff on the other side, but I want to give you a quick look at like some of the authors and themes that we can expect. So Black trans misogyny, or like trans misogynoir, very like common themes, words and phrases that you would see. I'm also thinking about like captivity and gender. So like C.C. McDonald is like one of the most like prevalent like authors and activists in this regard, and their work on the prison industrial complex and trans embodiment. I also listed out again some really popular authors about the topic, people who are writing about Black trans feminisms and things like criminality and criminal justice reform. And I put this quote here from C.C. McDonald because I just think it's, you know, a really good quote that kind of explains, you know, the work of Black trans feminism and how it relates to prisons and abolition. Next is settler colonialism. So I feel like most people would also, you know, expect to see critical affirmatives related to settler colonialism. You know, we see them already, so I don't expect those going away anytime soon. Much has been written by Native, Black and Native scholars on this subject. Some of those like common themes that you'll see coming up are ones that you also see in other literature bases like colonialism and carcerality, criminality and indigeneity, legislating criminality and settler legal systems. And again, here are some other important authors on the topic if you would like to investigate more. I think this quote by Luana Ross from an article in 2016 is also really appropriate here, because a lot of the work that Native scholars are doing to understand settler colonialism and the criminal justice system has to deal with sort of like the history and the evolution of like settlerism. So, you know, some of the first instantiations dealt with like forts that were established by settlers. And then, you know, we see things like residential boarding school systems and even like reservations to an extent. So there's a real strong historical and like modern relationship between settler colonialism and the criminal justice system. All right, next, this is another area where there is, you know, so much to explore potentially because there, you know, isn't just one like queer theory, but like broadly speaking, I think this is an area that can make a really big comeback just due to the association of deviancy and criminality, you know, with queerness. So those important themes, again, also include things like queer criminology, gender nihilism, abolition, and homo nationalism, liberalism, obviously, queer necropolitics, and more. So a lot of like the standard authors that maybe you've seen before, you know, maybe that's Poir, maybe that's, you know, Halberstam, Spade, etc. There are so much to be said about queerness and various queer identities in relation to criminal justice, especially Dean Spade. So if you're someone who wants to like look into that more, I would just Google Dean Spade and like all of their work, because there's a lot there. All right, the next one is Ole Reliable. We all know at this point it's not hard to, slap together a bunch of Gapgate cards and call an AF. There is, plenty to say about the relationship between capitalism and the prison industrial complex. There are like specific strands of critical criminology that specifically follow Marx. So it's not like the literature doesn't exist or anything like that on capitalism and prisons, but I don't imagine us seeing a lot of like just plain old cap AFs. It's not very strategic to just read an orthodox Marxism AF because not only are you vulnerable to things like framework and like every single critique of Marxism out there, and there are a lot, but you're also just vulnerable to a lot of impact turns, right? So I just don't envision a lot of these, but something to think about. All right, then, we have some FOMO adjacent stuff, these apps are inevitable, for whatever reason. I'm sure we'll hear something about, prisons, simulations, and the like. I don't imagine these apps being particularly popular or strategic. And I don't say all this to like be rude, but rather I just think from a strategy and like an interest like perspective, out of all the things that we could talk about as a community with regards to the violence of the criminal justice system, is, Baudrillard et al. Really the thing that we should be like focusing on? I don't know. If that's your scholarly interest, that's great, you do you, but I don't think it's the best avenue for critiquing the topic. And I'll admit I have some, some bias here. So take my opinion with a grain of salt if you truly believe that this is like the core of the topic. Okay. Now we're going to move on to discuss some themes across some of these like literature bases. We've already kind of touched on many of these, so I'm not going to be like very, repetitive. You probably picked up on these, obviously. And these might not be like exhaustive. There might be other broader themes, but these ones come up as the most common when doing critical research. I don't have time to go into all of them because this is supposed to be a short webinar, but now you at least kind of have a preview or like a glossary, a vocabulary to understand like where critical affirmatives like will be coming from and what their disads to framework might look like, or like what they might sound like. There might be something like the deviance disad or something, or the pathology disad or something. So these are things that I also would implore you to continue investigating and to continue researching. All right, so we definitely need to spend some time talking about abolition. I could give a whole talk on abolition, and I know we will have those lectures at camp. So this is just a very basic primer in relation to framework. You will hear abolition in a lot of framework debates, so I think it's important that you start reading about it now, thinking about it now, so you actually know how to answer it. There's a really big debate among scholars and activists, and that debate is abolition versus reform. And this also like isn't a new debate. This isn't something that like, just came up or just happened. This has been happening for decades. There are many definitions, frameworks and goals proffered by abolitionists. And not all people who describe themselves as abolitionists necessarily like agree on what abolition like entails. There are a few like shared tenets of an abolitionist framework that will be outlined on the next slide. Okay. So while not all self-described abolitionists agree on exactly like what the project entails, there are a lot of, again, like shared tenets, shared beliefs, and shared goals. And here's kind of what I was able to get from doing a lot of reading. First, it's an overall framework and a long-term strategy, not just like a one-off event or one, policy that we pass and poof, abolition. We can't just immediately evaporate prisons. It's more of an orientation, and it's more of a common process. Abolitionists don't have all the answers, and they don't, pretend to. I recently read a lot of really good Twitter threads on this, and it was like really insightful because people were asking abolitionists like a bunch of questions like, but what about murderers and stuff? Or what about this thing? How do we solve this? And one of the responses was prefaced with, abolitionists don't necessarily use like a linear step-by-step process to understand justice. That's not just like, a step-by-step manual necessarily, but there is this long-term strategy and vision, and that's always, the horizon. Next, it's not just about prisons. So obviously that's what, critical affirmatives will likely focus on given the topic, but it is concerned with broader prison culture and the relationship between, prisons and carcerality and, having punitive responses to things and just overall state sanctioned violence. Next, prisons are obsolete. We don't need them. Angela Davis wrote a whole book on this. I recommend people reading it if you can find it for free online. But all abolitionists agree, just based on the name, that we don't need prisons. They are not a necessary function of society. They cause net more violence than they do, solve and prevent violence. So we just don't need them. We also shouldn't try to build better, more humane prisons. We should just, again, abolish them. A lot of abolitionists take issue with reforms that are we should only get rid of private prisons because those are really bad, or we should try to make them, comfier and stuff. And abolitionists typically say that is a worse approach because it lulls us into a sense of complacency where we think we've done something really good for prisoners when we still have, people in cages. So it kind of limits our horizon. So this will definitely be an argument that K-teams make against the TBA. It's an argument that K-teams will make more broadly, just when they're neg. So that's something to think about. Next is that we can't really trust the state to monitor or constrain its own violence. Abolitionists often say that even if certain reforms sound really good in theory, do we really trust the state to enforce these new regulations? There's plenty of empirics to maybe suggest that we shouldn't, despite police having body cams, despite people, getting certain acts of violence on film, clearly it still doesn't result in, white people being held accountable. So. Next is that there are alternative models of justice that we ought to strive for. This is a big one, and it's a common framework that is often kind of thrown out there is restorative justice. But again, this is something that's not necessarily 100% agreed upon. And also things like, collective security that relies upon communities protecting themselves as opposed to relying on cops to protect them. Next, kind of a given, liberalism is a failed project. Abolitionists, are firmly anti-statist in nature. They don't think the state in all its forms should exist, and therefore, liberalism is also a bad idea. Next, it requires changing the conditions that lead to crime, violence, and suffering. And this is a really big part of abolition, which is that we need to focus on the conditions that lead people to do things that don't make sense, or that lead people to do things that harm other people within their own communities, things like poverty, you just not having jobs and other forms of policing. So abolitionists say we need to focus on providing people with things like healthcare, mental health services, and things like that. And that's how we will achieve ending prison culture writ large. Next is that, probably shouldn't be led by white people. Since the original abolitionist movement was founded in response to slavery, we probably, shouldn't have white people lead these movements. Not to say that white people, can't be involved, but the leaders of abolition should be people of color. That's something I was able to pick up on when I was doing my research. Okay. Next, there are some debates within abolitionist frameworks. They don't always agree on everything, just most people, most groups, most movements. So what do those internal debates consist of? Those, broadly speaking, kind of go into 4 different questions or categories. First is which model of justice should replace prisons? There is a lot of debate about this. Should it be restorative justice? Should it be victim-centered? Who is kind of in charge of where people go? What does collective security for communities look like? Maybe there are people who will try to just harm others. So how do we get around that? So that's, something that, that MEG teams should try to capitalize on, and things like, cross-examination. Next, are small victories still okay? Should we push for things like reduced sentencing or other things that generally seem like they would be, a good idea? When I was reading today a bunch of different texts on abolition to try to understand these debates and what they consist of, there was a lot of back and forth between people saying yeah, it would be really great if we could, increase visitation time. So we should push for that. But then there would be other people who were like, nope, like we shouldn't push for those things. We should, only focus on X. So it's, it's not just cut and dry for every single aspect of an abolitionist framework. Next, how do we get to the end goal of abolition? There's, a debate between, sort of like what movements, should be a part of, whether or not like what certain coalitions look like, things like that. It's the process aspect of abolition is something that is still like debated. Next, is it okay to operate within the state in any instance? Again, I kind of already, alluded to this, but this is something that really gets thrown around, and a lot of people don't always have like a clear-cut answer. Like, is it okay to push for small reforms at the local level if we think that it will make life materially better, or do we just kind of need to take almost like an anarchist, approach like to organizing and only focus on things like mutual aid outside of the state? Those things, like, again, aren't just cut and dry. There's not like one, right answer necessarily. So that's something that you'll probably see when you do your research or when you have these debates. Okay. All right, I just talked for a while about stuff without mentioning its applicability in debate. So if you're interested in going for a framework, you should consider the following. First, capitalize on the differences between certain abolitionist frameworks like we just talked about. Again, they're not all the same. This means that you'll be able to find cards that maybe say like it is okay to push for like small reforms within an abolitionist framework, or you might be able to find cards that say, it is okay to like, push for like local like reforms, state governments or something like that, right? Because there is not just one definition or one singular abolitionist framework, that leaves the door open for you to find those distinctions and to capitalize on those in debates. Next, find positive examples of reform that avoid the traditional pitfalls that abolitionists like talk about. I have a slide later that's just entirely on why you need to try to start like writing a list of examples, but this is important. If you can't like give a laundry list as to why reform is good and how it is empirically successful, you're probably not going to be successful against abolition. Next, think of it almost like a perm. So remember, most abolitionists say it's about creating a long-term strategy and a vision for justice. So think about how your TVA could be consistent with that long-term strategy. So like, for example, maybe it's okay for us to say like, yes, abolition is our end goal. That is always like what we are striving for, but it is still okay and consistent to push for things like sentencing reforms or, other things about, reforming the system to make life like better and more livable and to create momentum for these movements to potentially ask, for broader reforms in the future. And that's how we inevitably get to our end goal of abolishing prisons. Next, obviously switch side plays a role here, but I think you should explain why abolition should be considered core neg ground, right? Like we just talked about, the debate is over reform versus abolition. So if I'm the neg going for framework, I'm going to write up a block that says, look, abolition should be core neg ground and the affirmative should always have to defend reform. This produces, good debates for like X, Y, and Z reasons. I'm not going to write, your topic education block for you, but you will need to come up with reasons that explains why it's educationally preferable to have those debates in a predictable switch side format. And that's one way that you can, again, sort of subsume a lot of the apps like offense about abolition, but doing it on the neg is net better for topic education reasons. Okay. All right, next I want to talk about the TVA. So we know how important winning the topical version of the AF can be. One nice thing about this topic is that because there was such a lively and a robust debate among scholars about reform versus abolition, it means you're not going to have a hard time researching and cutting various topical versions. This also means that judges are probably going to expect you to do this. Like, yes, there are obviously judges who don't think you necessarily need a TVA to win, or you don't need cards or a solvency advocate to, say that a TVA like exists. But if we know those things exist, then like, why not cut them? Just seems like we're like selling ourselves short, or we're, decreasing our chances of victory. We don't necessarily have to. This is especially important for middle of the road judges or, K-leaning judges that you might get. If you don't do the bare minimum of cutting at least one TVA to demonstrate that literature does exist, you probably won't get very far with them. You're not always going to get, your favorite framework against gay teens because of things like, mutual press. So start doing this work now. Start researching now. You don't need a full, starter pack to get started on doing things like cutting TBAs and organizing them into your framework file. Next, make sure again that you're paying attention to the differences between certain critical asks. So remember, not all asks about like Black people should be answered the exact same. Utilize commonalities, yes, but don't just read your generic like Afropess TBA against an affirmative about like Black trans women, because that's not always like responsive, and it doesn't respond to the nuances that the affirmative will be making and that they will assuredly capitalize on. Next, look into what activist groups are saying. If you need like a solvency advocate, you don't really like know where to start. That's typically what I do when I start to cut TBAs like for my teams or like at camp, like for files. They often have very specific demands that make really good cards, and allows you to say that the TBA would be something radical, because it comes from people who are working on the ground and know actually like what would help their community. So it's usually a good thing, like perceptually as well, when you have cards that are coming from movement organizers and activists. Next, capitalize again on the differences amongst abolitionists. I've kind of already said that, but find cards that explain those differences. If you can clearly explain that the abolitionist movement is not like a monolith, then there are some ways that certain reforms, would be okay, and that you can often get a lot farther than a generic AF criticism of reform overall. Okay, next one. Debating the TBA as a counterplan at first. So this is, just kind of one potential strategic avenue that you can explore. I think you should at least try this out at camp or in practice debates. I'm not saying that you need to read a TBA as a counterplan in every debate, but there are some situations where it actually does make sense to at least introduce it as a counterplan in the 1NC. So here are some situations when it actually does make sense. So first, if you know the AF team will 100% grant you competition, now obviously that requires some scouting or something like a line in the 1AC that implies they will not perm something. If you've watched a team before, you got their docs or something, and you've seen them say something like, you can read reform counterplans and we won't perm them, then maybe you could, and maybe you just want to out-debate them on a counterplan, and that's, viable. I would also say, like, always ask and cross-ex no matter what, like, even if you scouted them before, because sometimes people change their mind and don't always answer things in the same way. The next situation where it makes sense is when you want to bait them into making a perm and then leveraging that on the TBA. So if you read the TBA as a counterplan in the 1NC, like as a separate off sheet, piece of paper, oftentimes the affirmative will make, a bunch of responses to it, but won't think of it as a TBA. So they might make some perms. And, at this point, you kind of know why that hurts them when it comes to framework, because making a permutation on a counterplan that, uses the state to pass a reform when the entire affirmative was about why those things are bad, well, the permutation clearly says that those things aren't mutually exclusive, that we can do those things together. So when you read a counterplan in the 1NC and they permit, that is a way that you can then leverage that on the topical version. So that way you don't necessarily have to go for it as a counterplan, but you can still go for framework in the 2NR and say, look, they already, made this argument for us. They've said that doing things like reform and, revolution or abolition, are not mutually exclusive, because if you can permute those things, it proves that there's, not an opportunity cost to combining them. Next, when you don't really have enough content for your 1NC, and sometimes this happens, like maybe you're debating a really specific affirmative and you're just like, I have no CapK links whatsoever. I got, I have framework right here, a bunch of, Gordon cards for the 1NC maybe, but I don't know like what else we're going to read. I was certainly there many times in my career. So you can unload all of your TBA evidence, assuming you have some, to put pressure on the 2AC. My partner and I actually did this a lot our senior year, and it was, fairly effective, because we, just invested time in cutting a bunch of different TBAs against different affirmatives about like healthcare and, justice and things like that. It meant that it put pressure on the 2AC to answer all of those things, right? Because now when you introduce like a specific TBA in the 1NC, the 2AC is expected, right, to answer all of those and to provide specific indites as to why those policies like are bad and don't, solve their affirmative or whatever. And oftentimes they just like wouldn't answer them. They would just make generic responses. The TBA still, does X thing that we said in the 1AC or whatever. So if you're just willing to take them up on the debate, and I think that you should be, it can be really effective to read it in the 1NC, because then it allows you to develop the TBA as opposed to just, saving it for the block and refusing to specify in the 1NC, which a lot of judges like don't like, kind of depends, but some judges don't like that. Next, if you have a judge who maybe isn't great for framework, but still thinks that it's a good idea to test the affirmatives like method. So for example, there are judges who think that like reading your AF, on the neg is a responsive or strategic or sufficient, use of neg ground against critical affirmatives. So if you have one of those judges and everything, maybe it's okay to read framework in the 1NC or something, or, whatever other neg arguments, but you can read all these TBAs that you have as a counterplan, and they might be persuaded by that. So that's another instance where it makes sense to have a file ready where your TBAs can be read as counterplans. Next, when you have a specific TBA, this one's fairly obvious, but like you can't read a TBA about, Black people against like a settler colonialism map and expect to win it at all, let alone as a counterplan. But sometimes you do end up having a really specific TBA, and if all the stars align, it can work in your favor. I don't think that happens all of the time, but it certainly does happen, to put it into like the realm of possibility. So again, it's worth thinking about, it's worth practicing at the very least. Okay. All right, so the last pro tip of the day is mostly just about examples and me trying to persuade you to start working on your examples. Cannot stress this enough. You will need a ton of examples that demonstrate that a reform can work and that it's not, just going to fail and it's not going to get rolled back and people aren't going to circumvent it, right? Yes, you can expect a lot of other circumvention debates this year. So you're going to have to learn how to provide examples that kind of get around that. And this is something that you can do before camp even starts. It's something you can do without camp, right? It's something that I'm, having my students do. Like they're going to create, different like headers and stuff, and they're going to come up with a bunch of lists of examples of positive reforms that have helped people, that have like been successful and everything. And that's going to really help, because if you don't provide these examples, your opponents are going to, right? Because like we discussed during the first part of this, there are so many examples and cards and everything that the affirmative will be able to capitalize on this topic. So it's imperative that you start to get ahead of that and find those examples early, so that way you're not scrambling in the middle of like 2NC prep. The next thing that I just have on here are like some suggested readings. So there's, if you look up like US prison culture, this website is extremely helpful. They have like a whole like bibliography basically of like prison abolition. So if you're like just wanting to understand it, like to understand like what these critiques are, what you can expect, definitely go, look at this list. Even if you're someone who doesn't want to ever read a K or whatever, you only ever plan on going for fairness, well, you need to understand what these criticisms are if you plan on, beating them. So go do some light reading, figure out what these arguments are so what they're saying and how to respond. There's also this like a really helpful FAQ from this site that just kind of explains like, all of the standard questions that you would probably ask in cross-ex, like, but where do all the really horrible people go? Or like, what about this? And it has like answers to it. And I found that really effective because it made me think like, oh, like this is probably how K teams will respond, if we ask those questions in cross-ex. This is a really popular article. It's often read in like the college debate side of things. It's the Kelly Catherine Abraham article on abolition and like burning it down. So that one's really good. Probably people will read it. So, if you want to read it and kind of get ahead, feel free to do so. And then this last one, I uploaded a very popular, Wilderson article about like prisons and prison reform. And I think this will be a very popular article that will be read for critical affirmatives and just like on the neg. So if you're an AF policy team or a neg team who wants to go to framework, go do some of this reading so you have the vocabulary and the background information and understanding of what these teams are going to say before the season actually starts. I think that is an easy way to get ahead and an easy way to ensure that you're ahead of the game as opposed to falling behind. Okay, we are open for CX.
All right, well, thank you, Jazzy. My dog is trying to get involved in this conversation. If you have any questions, feel free to just put them into the Q&A at the bottom. Our first question comes from Noah, and it's a pretty good one. Noah asks, it seems that critical apps next year will argue that the mechanism of CJR is bad and offer an alternative analysis that argues for the destruction of the criminal justice system using an actor. These teams will argue that they meet the action, but not the actor of the resolution. What do you think the best framework angle is against them?
That is a really good question. That reminds me of sort of soft framework approaches that some teams try to make, which is, you don't have to necessarily use the USFG, but you have to result in the end goal of doing so. So I have a couple of thoughts about how you would address that. First, there is the potential, of not reading framework against it, not because, you can't, but if this is a team who is reading an affirmative that says, yes, we, result in the end goal of getting rid of prisons or taking X, Y, and Z action, that means you can probably get dised links to those affirmatives. You probably can't get a politics link to it, obviously, because that's more based on the process of USFG action, but you can still, read counterplans and read other arguments that would be responsive. Next, in that scenario, you can just read topicality. You don't have to read your giant standard framework 1 and C necessarily. But then finally, the main sort of set of offense that you have to focus on is just, again, on the resolutional mechanism and why that is the only stable locus for limits and predictability and things like that, right? Because when we, again, approach the topic, we are assuming that the affirmative will likely use the actor that is proffered by the resolution. And so just because the AF, results in maybe the end goal of getting rid of all prisons ever, that still does not make them topical. So you would have to focus more of your offense just about the process and focusing on the resolutional actor and why that is good. You can also make an extra topicality argument, right? If the app is we'll use X movement to abolish all prisons, make an extra topicality argument. And I think that would also get you kind of far.
Well, great. Our next question is, how would you spin Black logistics as a way to indict the resolution or even connect it to the resolution?
If I understand the question, so let's see, the logistics stuff from Moten and Harney, I'm assuming that's what Anonymous is kind of talking about. I mean, most of those articles and those pieces focus on the distinction between policy, planning and things fugitivity. And again, I'm no expert. So if this is, coming from the perspective of wanting to write a really good, KF, maybe I'm not the best person to give that set of advice. But there are a lot of cards on this. I would just sort of Google racial capitalism, Moten and Harney and logistics. Because it is an indict of the resolutional mechanism. So if you have another specific follow-up, I can try to answer it.
Yeah, it seems like if you add to that search just prison reform,
yeah,
you will certainly find exactly what you're looking for to put that together. So our next anonymous question is, what are smart ways you think KAPs will approach the resolution besides abolition? So I'll augment this slightly. Also, what do you think at this point, the most threatening KAF is from the AS perspective?
I definitely think abolition is, because that's just, again, even if it's not just an app that's entirely about abolition, it is a common theme within all critical literature bases. So it's something that, even if, we don't think that that's what the 1AC will be about entirely, it's something that we have to be prepared to answer. So like I said, Afropessimism will be huge. Like there's just a new book like put out on it. There's going to be a lot of 2020 like really good cards on it. Like there's so much literature, and like I mentioned earlier, I think like the problem that K teams will have on the app is just choosing which cards to read, because there are so many. So it's a good year to be a K team. And like I mentioned too, I think like a lot of queerness apps like will make a comeback. I don't think we saw a lot of those on the arms sales topic. Like there were a couple, but they weren't the most prevalent or the ones that were like winning the most. And the same is true for like immigration. Like immigration, a really popular one was like anti-blackness and settler colonialism. But I do think that criminal justice reform lends itself to being very good for teams who want to talk about queerness. So I think we'll see a lot of that.
Our next question is from Gotham. Is it worth saying abolition isn't reform to prove that the AF's attempt to defend the mechanism of the resolution, but not the actor, would still not meet CJR?
Read this again, make sure I'm understanding. Is it worth saying that abolition isn't reform, but not? Oh, okay, I see what you're saying now. Yeah, like I still think so. Like it's worth saying that abolition like doesn't meet reform, because that's kind of true, right? Because it's the opposite. So sorry, Gautam, I'm not sure if I like totally understood like your question. But yeah, like I still think that you should say that if you're trying to go like for framework. If you still want to go for like disads or something, then maybe you can kind of concede that like, yes, they do get rid of all of this stuff and they end up getting rid of prisons or whatever to gain offense, but their interpretation and their model of debate is still unfair for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Isaac has a question about abolition and what those movements endorse were actions by the state. If the state was to take any actions, which ones would become, or what would be an alternative to the state be?
Okay, yeah, good question. So as I mentioned, there is not like a unified like answer on this necessarily. There are a lot of debates like between them. Like I said, I was reading one article today where someone was like, you know what, I think it's okay to push for, things like, increasing visitation time or visitation rights, and that can still be a part of our abolitionist horizon. But then I've read other like articles like the Kelly Catherine Abraham one that was just like, no, like at no point can we work within the state. That is the opposite of our goal. That just ends up colluding and co-opting things, right? So it really depends, and that's why you kind of have to pick and choose in that regard. So it really just depends, I guess. I know it's not super satisfactory, but you will be able to find cards that say like that are on both sides.
So our next question is, what AFs do you think can be topical and still have a critical approach to the topic?
Kind of depends. So for example, like maybe there is a way to win kind of like the soft like framework approach, like when you're affirmative, like the question that someone asked earlier, which is, you defend, like getting rid of prisons or something like that, but you don't want to use like the USFG as an actor. So typically people call this like defending the, like action like of the resolution, but not like the object necessarily. And that can often get people pretty far, even in front of like framework leaning judges that I've seen, like at least, again, that's not like a monolith or whatever, but that can get you far. Also, I think there's a way for people to write like critical, like, soft left affirmatives that are like, that use maybe a state action, but they say that it's a way to get towards abolition. Now, obviously, if you framed it like that, you would get into a bunch of like extra T debates, but oftentimes teams don't want to solely go for extra T against a critical affirmative like that, because it just doesn't seem that persuasive to a lot of judges. So kind of depends.
All right, are you ready for a TVA lightning round?
Oh, yeah.
All right, our first question. What is a way for the TVA to resolve the offense about abolition if they say abolition is the only way to solve the CJR system?
Yes. So the way that you answer that is by finding evidence and making arguments about how even doing small reforms are part of an abolitionist strategy and a long-term goal. Like I mentioned, and as abolitionists concede, abolition isn't just like a one-off event. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes a lot of small steps, small movements at the micro level to achieve, change to the overall system. So if I'm the neg going for framework, I would say, look, our TVA is compatible with abolition. We think that prisons should go away, but we think that one of the small things that we can do in the interim to get there is to pass X reform or whatever, because that creates momentum for movements, right? It's all about framing. One thing that I really saw that was consistent across all these texts and stuff was that it's about framing and having a very particular long-term strategy. So if the TVA kind of says look, we think abolition is the end goal, we're very anti-state and stuff, but there is something we can do in the interim to create momentum.
All right, round 2 of the lightning round. When debating the TVA as a counterplan, would you just use reform good or state good as the net benefit, or some other net benefit?
Yeah, I think both. Reform good is just the more specific version of state good, as a net benefit. So that's kind of what I would do. Just find a bunch of different reasons as to why reform is good. But then another part of that too is that you have to play a lot of defense to whatever structural claims that the affirmative is making. So, if they're, making arguments about gratuitous violence, the 3 pillars and all of that, you'll still have to play defense there. So that way, the counterplan is, capable of absorbing all the other offense in the affirmative.
And then, I believe this is our last question. Besides specificity, what are other good qualities of a topical version of the affirmative from a strategic standpoint?
Yeah, specificity, I think, is the main one. The next thing is having cards. Having cards is always better than not having cards, which could be true of any debate argument. Like I said, there are a lot of judges who will say I don't think you need to have a card for a TVA, right? Which is fairly reasonable, but if you have cards, that's only going to increase your chance of winning. So as I mentioned, researching the demands of specific activist organizations or movements will get you very, very far. Also just making sure that you're writing out blocks for the TVA, and also just, making sure that you're doing all the other checklist framework things, explaining how dis adds to the, TVA or neg ground, things like that. But broadly speaking, TVAs are strategic because they allow you to capture a lot of the app's offense, while also still resolving your offense. So.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jasmine. This was very informative, and I think these debates will be pretty interesting this year, at least in comparison to the framework debates I saw on arms sales. We look forward to your gauntlet in early July, and it should be pretty exciting as your thoughts on this develop. We are also providing a lot of new content on Canvas, so keep an eye out for that. We've got starter set up with files coming out pretty regularly, as well as new podcasts on HS Impact and a number of mini lectures that have been posted on the lectures portion of Canvas. Be sure to follow us on social media. Our handle is Michigan Debate on pretty much everything, as well as you can follow HS Impact on Facebook. And we look forward to working with you all this summer. Thanks, and go blue.
Go blue.